My name is Evelyn. I'm 65 years old, and some time ago, I started falling in love with my best friend's widower. It wasn't something I wanted, or something I was looking for. Margaret and I were inseparable, and when she left, she made one request. Take care of him. I promised, without knowing what would come next, because little by little, between the silence and the empty Sundays, what started as care turned into love. And that love carried a weight, the weight of guilt, the weight of judgment, the weight of feeling wrong. This is the story of a love that tried not to be born, but it was born, with respect, with fear, with truth, and of a woman who, in trying to honor a friendship, discovered that the greatest gift she had been given was permission to love again. If you love stories that move you and warm your heart, you're in the right place. This is Bonds of Time, and today, I'm going to tell you a story about grief, second chances, and true love. I never thought I'd write these words, never imagined the heart could feel so torn between love and guilt, between loyalty and the desire to keep living. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 65, and for almost half my life, I was Margaret Thompson's best friend, a woman I loved like a sister. We shared confessions, laughter, faith, and an unspoken promise that certain lines should never be crossed. But life, with its cruel irony, put a choice in front of me that no woman should ever have to face. Margaret passed 2 years ago. Bone cancer. It was a long, painful fight, full of hopes that crumbled like dry leaves in the wind. I was with her at every appointment, every prayer, every silence. In her final days, I was the one holding her hand when words no longer came. I remember her eyes, calm, as if she already knew she was leaving something behind. She asked me only one thing, not to let John be alone. He's going to need someone, she whispered, struggling. You're the only one I trust. I nodded, because I never imagined it would lead to this. In the months that followed, I kept my promise. I brought soup, helped with the garden, sorted through insurance paperwork, sat with him in silence on Sunday afternoons. And slowly, the pain that separated us began to bring us together. John was quiet, always respectful, but there was a kind of grief in the way he looked at me, like someone recognizing the only witness to what was lost. And I, foolish or maybe just too human, started waiting for those glances. Not out of vanity, but because it was the only moment I felt seen. The first time I dreamed about him, I woke up startled. I prayed. I cried. I asked God for forgiveness, and Margaret too, as if she were still there, listening. I thought about pulling away, skipping Sundays, disappearing, just to stop this feeling from growing. But how do you leave someone who's also trying to survive? How do you pretend your heart isn't beating just because logic tells you to silence it? The truth is, love doesn't ask permission. It walks in uninvited, even into grieving homes. I swore to myself I would fight it, that I wouldn't let this shadow grow inside me, because even if no one else knew, I knew, and that alone was enough to condemn me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the looks started coming from outside too. At the library book club, Dottie made a snide comment when she saw John offering me a ride home. You two have gotten pretty close, haven't you? She said with that crooked smile people use when they pretend they're joking. I smiled back without replying, and in that moment, I realized something. Other people were starting to notice too, and they weren't ready to accept it. John, in turn, grew more and more cautious. He never brought it up, but sometimes he'd sit in silence for minutes, staring into his teacup like he was searching for answers. There was a growing distance between us, built from fear and respect. And still, whenever our eyes met, there was something holding us there, something I couldn't name, only feel. And that was the scariest part. On a cold October afternoon, we went to the cemetery together to leave flowers on Margaret's grave. It would have been their wedding anniversary. He brought white lilies, her favorite. We stood there, both silent. I didn't know where to place my hands or how to look at him. As we turned to leave, John gently touched my arm. It was a quick gesture, but enough to make my heart race, and enough to be seen. One of their sons, Peter, was sitting in a parked car just ahead. When his eyes met ours, time froze. There was no scene, no words spoken in that moment, just a heavy silence that followed me for days. Peter didn't call, but he stopped replying to my messages about the community event. And when we crossed paths at church, he looked away. It felt like I had suddenly lost my right to exist in that space. Not because of something I had done, but because of something everyone assumed I would do, even though it hadn't happened yet. That night, I cried like I hadn't in years. It wasn't just fear, it was shame, and a deep sadness for not knowing whether I had the right to be happy, or if my life was forever bound to the shadow of an old promise. I tried to pull away. I stopped visiting John's house for weeks, came up with excuses to skip community gatherings, turned off my phone early to avoid invitations. I walked alone through the library hallways and left church early, always with the sense that someone was watching me. It felt like everyone already knew, even if they didn't. Like I wore a shameful secret on my face. But deep down, I wasn't running from him. Running from John was easy. The hard part was running from myself. On a gray afternoon, I sat on the park bench where Margaret used to feed the birds. I brought stale bread, just like she did, but the birds never came. I sat there for over an hour, staring at the fallen leaves, asking God if love and guilt could truly live side by side. I never asked for this, I whispered. I just wanted to stay faithful to her. But the heart doesn't respond to prayers like that. It just beats. And sometimes it beats louder for someone we never expected. Dottie called me that same day. She said she was worried. I thought it was another attempt to fish for information, but she surprised me. You don't owe anyone an explanation, she said gently. But if what you feel is real, maybe that's another way of honoring Margaret. It threw me off. I never thought I'd hear something like that from her. But at the same time, it reminded me of a question I'd never dared to ask. Did Margaret know? I went home and looked for an old notebook where Margaret used to write her prayers. I'd kept it as a memory, but rarely opened it. I flipped through the pages with trembling hands, not knowing exactly what I was looking for, until I found, tucked between two loose sheets, a small folded note in an envelope with my handwriting on it. To Evelyn, open when you feel her absence. My heart nearly stopped. She must have left it there during her last days, when I was folding laundry in the room. Why hadn't she told me? I sat in the armchair and opened it carefully. The words came like warm air on a winter day. She spoke of gratitude, of love, and of how she knew I was the only one who wouldn't leave her alone. And in the final lines, she wrote, "If one day you and John find comfort in each other, don't punish yourself. My love for both of you was never meant to be a cage. Take care of him, and take care of yourself too." I cried with the paper pressed to my chest, as if she were still there, giving me permission to keep on living. The following Sunday, I went back to church, hair down, blue dress, the same one Margaret always said brought out my eyes. I didn't go out of courage. I went out of need. I couldn't bear to carry it all alone anymore. John was sitting in the second row. When he saw me, he raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised, then gave me a soft smile, the kind that says thank you without a sound. I sat 2 rows behind him. We didn't speak. But there, between psalms and prayers, there was a silent conversation happening between us. After the service, I waited outside. He came up to me, hesitant. "You disappeared," he said, without blame. "I needed silence," I answered. We walked together to the parking lot. Then, without looking at him, I pulled Margaret's letter from my pocket. I placed it in his hands. He read it right there, leaning against his car, and when he finished, his eyes were full of tears. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew before we did." I nodded, my chest tight, and in that moment, something between us shifted. It wasn't a kiss, not even a hug. It was the most intimate silence I've ever shared with someone. The kind of silence only those who have grieved can understand. We stood there, still, looking at each other like people recognizing an old house, one that had always been there, but was only now being seen as home. And that was the day I realized there was no use denying it anymore. What I felt wasn't just loneliness, it was love. And love doesn't disappear just because the world disapproves. That night, I spoke to God in a way I hadn't in a long time. I didn't ask for anything. I just gave thanks. For Margaret, for her kindness, even after death. For John, for the truth that even arriving late still had time to bloom. And I asked, if this love was truly allowed, for the strength to walk with it. Because more than just feeling it, I knew the hardest part was still to come, facing what others would say, and they did. Dottie called me, this time crying. Peter showed up at my door the next day. His eyes were hard, his words even harder. "You were my mother's best friend. How could you?" I didn't answer right away. I simply invited him in. And there, for the first time, I told the whole story. No embellishments, no excuses, just the truth. Because I was no longer willing to live in hiding, and if loving someone was a crime, I'd commit it again. Peter stood still, as if standing in a place he didn't want to know. His presence unsettled me, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. Society's judgment, Margaret's memory, the eyes of those who watch from the outside. I sat in the armchair and waited for him to speak. "Do you have any idea what this means for my family?" he said, his voice shaky. "She trusted you." I nodded, eyes full of tears, and that's exactly why it took me so long to accept that what I feel isn't betrayal, it's love. And love can be born from care too. He paced the room like someone searching for a final argument. "You were friends your whole lives. My mom loved you like a sister." That pierced right through me. "And I loved your mother too," I replied. "But wasn't it her who taught us not to abandon those who suffer, to stay even when everyone else leaves?" He looked at me, surprised. There was anger in his eyes, but also confusion, because the truth, when it's sincere, has a way of disarming even the most tightly held resentment. "He still cries for her," Peter said quietly. "I do too," I answered, "and maybe that's what connects us. The same grief, the same absence." We fell silent. He looked at me like he was seeing someone for the first time. Then he sighed and said, "Just promise me one thing, that you'll do this right. No hiding, no shame. If this is going to happen, let it happen in the open." I promised, because there was no more reason to pretend, and in that moment, I felt the weight of judgment lift just a little. John called me that night, said he knew Peter had come, and before I could explain how it went, he said, "I'm with you, Evelyn, no matter what comes." That moved me more than any grand declaration ever could, because it was real. It was the kind of love that doesn't need poetry, just courage. And I was ready for that. For the first time, I was ready to live without hiding. The next morning, we went for a walk together, for the first time, holding hands. Some people looked at us with surprise, others with disapproval. But there were also those who smiled from a distance, who understood. And I decided, right then, that my life would no longer be shaped by the eyes of others, but by the truths my heart could no longer ignore. Sitting on his porch, with a blanket over our knees and 2 mugs of tea in hand, John told me something he'd never said out loud. I started feeling something for you while Margaret was still alive. It wasn't desire. It was peace. You brought peace, and I hated myself for it. I lowered my eyes. So did I. That was the first time we admitted that our love didn't begin at the end. It only revealed itself once silence made space for it. We sat quietly for a few minutes, listening to the birds and the rustling trees. It was autumn again. The leaves let go with the dignity of something that understands its time has come. And in that quiet moment, I realized the guilt I had carried for so long wasn't because I had done something wrong. It was the fear of being judged. Because loving, even when it comes at the wrong time, isn't a sin. The real sin is abandoning the chance to be happy out of fear of living. My conversations with Dottie continued. She had become, surprisingly, my greatest ally. "You know what I think?" she said one Saturday afternoon. "Margaret didn't just know. I think she hoped for this. Because love like that, Evelyn, doesn't happen by accident. It's built, and you and John spent years building something without even noticing." I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe true love isn't the kind that shows up with fireworks and grand promises. Maybe it's the kind that endures, that blooms in silence, that survives pain. A few weeks later, John invited me to have dinner with his kids and grandkids. Just a simple gathering in the backyard. I was nervous, but I went. His daughter-in-law greeted me with a shy smile. His teenage granddaughter gave me a long, quiet look, and Peter offered a hesitant hug. There was no celebration, but there was space, and for me, that was already a beginning. After dinner, John held my hand in front of everyone. He didn't say a word, but no one needed him to. That night, I wrote a letter to Margaret. It didn't need to be sent, but I needed to write it. I told her about the fear, the struggle, the love that had grown where no one expected. And I ended with a line that came straight from my soul. "Thank you for leaving me something so beautiful, even without knowing." I folded the paper, tucked it into her Bible, and went to sleep in peace. Because I finally understood the love she left me was also the love she trusted me to take care of. After that family dinner, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just about courage anymore. It was about belonging. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was part of something that made sense. The small gestures, a note John left at my gate, a single flower placed quietly on a church bench, became part of a daily life filled with a quiet, mature love that didn't need to prove itself. And to me, that was a miracle. Because after so much guilt, I had finally found peace. I started picking up pieces of myself I'd left behind. I began painting again. Margaret always said I had an artist's hands. I pulled out the old paints from the cabinet and painted the garden of what was once her house, now ours. I can't say if it turned out beautiful, but as I painted, I cried. Not out of sadness, but out of gratitude, for everything I had lived with her, and for having time still to live something new with him. Because life, even when it feels late, always offers a new morning. John took me to the trail where he and Margaret used to walk on their anniversary. I thought it might feel strange, but it didn't. I felt she was there with us. He spoke of her with warmth, without hesitation, and I listened, without jealousy. Because what connected us now wasn't Margaret's absence. It was her presence in everything. She was in every stone along the path, in every word he spoke, in every silence we shared. And maybe that's why the love between us felt so whole. The gossip in town didn't stop right away. There were still people who frowned when they saw us together, but I no longer took it in the same way. I had learned that true love doesn't need an audience, just honesty. And our truth was clear. I loved him, and he loved me, not out of lack, not for convenience, but because life had shaped us for this. Through pain, through waiting, through friendship, and through loss. And most of all, through respect. One evening, John asked if I believed in new beginnings. I told him I didn't just believe in them. I was living one. "You know what I love most about you?" he said with a gentle smile. "You never tried to take her place." I looked at him tenderly. "And you never compared me to her. Maybe that's why we work." He nodded, and there under the warm glow of the lamp, our hearts finally rested, beating in the same rhythm. The following spring, I decided to plant roses in the garden. Margaret liked lilies, but always said red roses had a soul. I went to the town's flower shop and picked out the healthiest ones I could find. Peter happened to pass by and saw me with my hands in the dirt. I thought he might turn away. But instead, he walked over and helped me with the tools. We didn't talk about the past. We just shared the moment. Sometimes forgiveness comes that way, quiet, almost invisible, but permanent. That same day, I brought one of the rose arrangements to Margaret's grave. I went alone. I sat on the stone bench in front of her headstone and placed the flowers gently. I spoke softly, as if she could still hear me. "Everything's okay now, my friend. He's doing well. I'm doing well. And thank you for not leaving me alone in this world." A breeze passed through, and for a moment, the tree beside me seemed to bow in acknowledgement. I smiled and walked away with a peaceful heart. John was waiting for me on the porch, with 2 cups of tea and a blanket. It was our ritual now. We sat together, watching the sunset, listening to the sounds of a simple life. There were no grand declarations, no overblown promises, just presence, just care. And maybe that's what love becomes after 60, not fireworks, but a steady flame that warms and stays. Some people would never understand. There would always be those who judged. But there were also those who, seeing us together, were reminded that life doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. And love, when it's real, always finds new ways to continue. I learned that from Margaret. And now with John, I was living it. Not as a replacement, but as a continuation. The story we lived didn't start as a romance. It began in grief, in friendship, in silence. But now, we walked hand in hand down a path that belonged only to us, even if it was paved with her memory. And over time, I realized that might be the most beautiful way to honor someone you love, by continuing to love, by continuing to live. I began to look at my own story with more kindness. For so many years, I defined myself by the choices I didn't make, the love I didn't live, the guilt I placed on my own shoulders. But now, with John by my side, I saw time differently. Not as something lost, but as something still unfolding. Each morning beside him was a new page. And even if our book was closer to the end, I was discovering that the last chapters could still be the most beautiful. We started planning little trips. Nothing grand, just places filled with good memories, or places Margaret once dreamed of seeing. We went to Asheville to see the fall leaves, to Charleston to stroll the old streets. In each place, we left a flower in her name. It was our way of bringing her with us, of showing that she had not been replaced, but honored. And without even realizing it, the love that was born from grief had begun to bloom in life. Lightly, respectfully, honestly. I received a letter from Margaret's granddaughter, a sweet, curious, and sensitive teenager. She wrote that she had heard the stories, the whispers, the opinions, and had come to a conclusion of her own. If my grandmother chose you as her friend, it's because she knew she could trust you. And if Mr. John chose you now, it's because she still can. I read that letter with tears in my eyes, the paper trembling in my hands. Sometimes wisdom comes from the young. Sometimes love plants its seed in them. John gave me a gift on our first Christmas together, a picture frame with a photo of the three of us, him, me, and Margaret, taken at some birthday long ago. "This is who we are," he said. "There is no us without her, but there is no me without you anymore." I thanked him silently, because there was no way to explain what that meant. It felt like all the years of doubt, pain, and guilt were finally being held, one, by the truth of something pure. Sometimes I think that if Margaret were still alive, none of this would have happened. And it's okay to think that, because life doesn't give us all the answers, but it does invite us to keep walking. And I accepted that invitation, because I realized I don't live in her place. I live in what was left of her. I live in what she gave us. And because of that, I love with even more care, more patience, more faith. That afternoon, I sat on the garden swing with John beside me. The sunlight filtered through the oak tree, painting golden shapes on the ground. He held my hand the way he always did, steady, yet gentle. We had been together for over a year, and love, contrary to what I once thought, hadn't grown less intense. It had grown calmer, like a river that had learned how to move around the stones without losing its direction. I told him about a dream I had with Margaret. In the dream, she was standing in the garden, picking flowers, smiling peacefully. She simply said, "You two took your time, didn't you?" Then turned away to tend to the plants. John smiled. I think she knew all along, and I believed it too. Because the truth is, sometimes real love doesn't need to be spoken. It shows up in the details, in gestures, in silences only true love can understand. We decided to write a letter together, not to her, but to ourselves, like a sort of pact. We wrote about everything we had faced, what we missed out on because of fear, and what we still hoped to live, even at our age. We placed the letter inside a small wooden box and buried it in the garden, beneath the roots of the roses I had planted. It was our symbol, that what is planted with courage will bloom, even when no one else believes. People in town weren't talking about us much anymore. Some had accepted it, some remained quiet, others moved on with their lives, and that was enough. Because we had learned that mature love doesn't need approval, only commitment, and we were committed to her memory, to life, to each other, and above all, to the truth you see in the eyes of those who have lived long enough to know that loving is always an act of faith. On the last page of Margaret's journal, there was a sentence, barely legible, as if her hand had already grown too weak to hold the pen. It read, "Love doesn't die, it just changes clothes and keeps walking." I closed the journal with trembling hands, because now I understood. The love she left me wasn't a burden. It was a gift I had slowly learned to accept with gratitude. Over time, our days found a new rhythm. There was no rush, No big plans, just a routine, and within it, a quiet kind of beauty. John cared for the garden with patience. I wrote letters I never sent, just to keep the feeling alive that there were still stories inside me. Sometimes we went out to buy bread and came back with plants. Sometimes we just sat in silence, listening to the birds. And that silence no longer felt heavy. It was full of meaning. One afternoon, I organized a box of old memories Margaret had left me years ago, filled with photographs, postcards, magazine clippings, and small objects she used to keep, just because maybe one day they'd hurt a little less. Among them, I found a forgotten photo, the three of us sitting in the garden, laughing at something silly. I looked at that picture and realized time doesn't erase people. It simply finds new ways to keep them present. I showed the photo to John. He smiled, but his eyes turned glassy. "She loved you," he said. "I think part of the love she had for me lived in you too. And maybe that's why we're able to love each other now, so honestly." His words touched me in a way few things ever had. It felt like every loose thread, every tangled knot of the past, had finally come undone, and what remained was simply lightness. The following week, we visited the orphanage where Margaret used to volunteer. We brought books, flowers, and an apple cinnamon cake, her recipe. The children surrounded us with curious eyes. One little girl tugged at my dress and said, "You smell like a happy grandma." I smiled, not knowing what to say, but I understood that somehow all this love, which began with so much pain, was now overflowing into others, and that was enough. On the way home, in the car, John held my hand and said, "I don't want to leave this world without people knowing I loved you." I looked at him, eyes full, because I felt the same. It was no longer about hiding or protecting someone else's memory. It was about living, fully, what we still had left, and making sure each day, no matter how simple, held the glow of something real. I knew the time had come to close this chapter, at least on paper. Life would go on, of course, but I needed to preserve this part of the story like one presses a flower between the pages of a book, with care, with tenderness, with gratitude. I wrote everything in my journal, the one I keep in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, and on the last page, I left a note to myself. You survived the guilt, and in the end, it was love that saved you. That month, John gave me a new notebook. The cover was blue, the same shade as the dress I wore to Margaret's funeral. He didn't say anything, just left it on the table with a white rose on top. I understood the gesture. It was time to write a new story. Not as someone who forgets the last one, but as someone who understands that living is about stitching chapters together, from who we were, what we lost, and what we still can become. On Margaret's birthday, we held a small service at home. We invited her children, a few old friends, and some of the children from the orphanage. We didn't talk about grief. We talked about legacy, about faith, about the kind of love that stays. And at the end, we read a line she once wrote on an old card. "If someday I'm no longer here, remember this. I always wanted you to be happy, even if it's without me." And in that moment, everyone understood, including me. After everyone had gone, I walked to the garden alone. The red roses were in bloom. I touched one gently, as if I were touching the very memory of my friend. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me." And in that whisper, there was everything I'd never been able to say out loud, because true love doesn't need a stage, it only needs space. I walked back inside and found John in the kitchen, making tea. I came up behind him and wrapped my arms around him. "Are we okay?" I asked. He turned around and said, "We're more than okay. were right. And I knew right then that this story had been told in the most honest way possible, because it wasn't just about two broken hearts finding each other. It was about three lives that became entwined and learned that love doesn't belong to anyone. When it's pure, it takes root. Some people ask if I would have done anything differently, and for a long time my answer would have been yes. I would have run away sooner, avoided the meetings, silenced what my heart kept trying to say. But today, no. Because I've come to understand that some loves aren't born from longing, but from care. Loves that rise out of pain, as a response to a kind of emptiness no one else understands. And when that kind of love arrives, we may resist it, but we can't ignore it. I started writing letters to myself, not journals, not confessions, just letters, some about life with Margaret, others about the conversations with John, others still about the days I thought I wouldn't survive the loneliness. It was a way of seeing myself with more kindness, because for so many years I demanded perfection from myself that I forgot how to be human. And now each letter was a reminder I deserved tenderness too. John began calling me his light keeper, said that when everything feels dark, all he has to do is look at me, because I don't dim. I laugh, I listen, I stay. And he stayed too. He stayed when I needed to cry out my guilt. He stayed when I wept in the middle of the night without knowing why. He stayed even when it would have been easier to walk away. And maybe that's what love does after 60. It doesn't promise heaven or forever. It simply promises presence and keeps it. One day, as we walked hand in hand, he stopped in front of a park bench and said, "This is where she told me she was sick, and this is where I promised I wouldn't stop smiling." We sat down, and he looked at me. "Today, I'm keeping that promise with you." My eyes filled, because I understood once and for all that this wasn't about replacing Margaret. It was about fulfilling what she herself had asked, that he wouldn't be alone. And he wasn't. The photos in the house remained the same. Margaret was still in every frame down the hallway, and she would stay there, because our story didn't need to erase any memories to move forward. On the contrary, her memories are the ground we walk on now, and everything we live today is in some way a tribute, a quiet thank you to the woman who brought us together, even after she was gone. We decided to make a small wooden sign for the garden. We carved into it, "Here bloomed the love she left behind." We placed it beside the oldest rose bush, the one that survives even on the coldest days. Every time I look at that sign, I feel like the past, present, and future are all gathered there, between branches, roots, and open petals. Because some stories don't end, they simply bloom again, in new colors. On a sunny Saturday, we hosted Margaret's children for lunch. It was the first time they were all together since the funeral. There was a different kind of peace in the air. No one needed to mention the past. The conversations were easy. The laughter came effortlessly. And when I got up to serve the cake, her daughter-in-law joined me in the kitchen and said, "She would have been happy for you both." That moved me deeply. Even the silence in the house felt warmer. John and I danced to an old song that evening, just the two of us in the living room. He put on the vinyl she used to love most and reached for my hand. "May I?" I smiled, always. We danced slowly, eyes closed, like holding a memory with care. And I thought, this is what we are now. Two survivors of loss, gently dancing with life, without hurry, without guilt, without fear. That night, I wrote my final letter to myself. It said, "You survived the judgment of others, and more than that, you survived your own. And now, Evelyn, you get to live." I folded the paper and placed it with the others, not to forget, but to reread someday and remember. There was a time when fear almost won, but it didn't, because love was stronger. And if someone asked me today what Margaret left me, I would answer with certainty. She left me the right to be happy, and that inheritance is the most beautiful anyone could give, because only those who truly love want the other to go on, even when they're no longer here. Last fall, we took a short trip to the lake where Margaret used to spend her vacations. It was a quiet place, with golden trees and the kind of silence that feels welcoming, not distant. We sat on a wooden bench, holding hands, and simply watched the water move slowly. "You know what I feel?" John said. "That we were each other's second chance." And he was right. At 65, I had already accepted that my love story might have ended before it even began. That my role was to stay on the sidelines, to support others, to be a good friend, a good neighbor, a kind companion. But to live something so deep, so unexpected, and yet so right, was like finding a flower growing through the asphalt. A part of me I thought had dried up bloomed again, and the most beautiful part, it came with permission. John and I wrote a new routine together, made of evening tea, short walks, old movies, pencil-written letters, and whispered prayers before sleep. Nothing was grand, but everything was real. I learned that love in later life doesn't need to prove itself. It only needs to be present. And that kind of presence, steady, honest, loyal, made me understand I hadn't lived a forbidden love. I had lived a possible one. On my last visit to Margaret's grave, I brought something different, not flowers, but a small picture frame with the three of us in it, me, her, and John, on some ordinary day, during some happy moment. I placed it gently against the stone, as if to say, "Look, my friend," we continued. And I cried. But not out of pain. I cried with gratitude. For having been chosen to love twice, once in friendship, and once in starting over. I don't know how much time we still have, but I know that every day lived without hiding, without fear, without shame, is already a gift I carry like a treasure. And if there's one thing I can leave for those who come after me, it's this. It's never too late for love, as long as it comes with respect, with truth, and with peace. Today, I write these words with a light heart, and when I close my eyes, I can see her. Margaret, smiling, not with jealousy, not with sadness, but with that calm look she always had when she knew everything was right. She left me, John, not as an inheritance, but as an invitation to continue what she started, to love, to care, to stay. This story is not about betrayal or guilt. It's about being human, about two wounded hearts finding shelter in each other, and about a friendship so true, it kept protecting us even after the end. Margaret loved us with greatness, and it was that greatness that set me free. If one day someone hears this story and wonders, is it right to love after someone is gone? My answer will be, it's always right to love, whenever it's true, whenever it's honest, whenever it comes from a clean heart. Because love doesn't die with the one who leaves. It transforms, it multiplies, and sometimes it heals. John and I are still together, not waiting for big events, but celebrating the small miracles, a shared cup of coffee, a song that still makes us dance, a memory that pulls us closer rather than apart. We are each pieces of something that was beautiful, and still is, because when love is sincere, it doesn't end. It simply finds new ways to exist. So if you've made it this far and you're hearing my voice, I just want to tell you one thing. Never give up on the possibility of loving again, even when it seems unlikely, even when others don't understand, even when your own guilt tries to stop you. Because sometimes the love that seemed lost was only waiting for the right time. And that's how I finally understood. She didn't leave me alone. She left me love. And that was the greatest gift I've ever received. Not every love begins with a glance. Some begin with loss, with silence, with a quiet kind of care that slowly grows roots. And not every beautiful story is the easiest to tell. Sometimes it's the one you live with a divided heart, but a peaceful soul. Because true love, the kind that survives judgment, fear, and memory, doesn't need to explain itself. It just needs to be lived with truth. This is the story of someone who loved twice, and of how, in the end, the love that once seemed impossible turned out to be the truest of all.